So I am very happy to be with you today and to share some thoughts about the experience of young people and faith. The path I want to take here, and I don't present myself as an expert. I'm not a sociologist of American religion. I'm not a theologian at the levels of university life, PhD theologians, but I am somebody who spent the better part of my adult life in youth ministry and education of young people within the Catholic system. And I like to think that over the 9 years now that I've been the president at Loyola, we've spent an awful lot of time and effort and strategizing about how to be better at this core mission, which is the formation of our young people in the life of faith. And we've done a lot of things. Many of them have worked, some have not, and I can share some of those learnings with you today. If you look at the handout, there's three main questions I'm trying to wrestle with. And again, I couch this in the disclaimer that I'm not an expert, but can offer some perspective. So first, a little bit about our context. In the Jesuit pedagogical paradigm, in the Jesuit way of doing education, we always start with the context. Where are we, and what is the context within which we are doing this ministry? Secondly, and related to that, is how did we get here? And then thirdly, what do we do? This would be useless if there weren't some practical insights about where we go from here and what we might do. Kudos to all of you, to Father Jerry and the leadership of the parish for having this conversation today. Kudos for bringing Randy on board and really being very, very serious about all of this. I'd like to start with you reflecting for a moment about your own life. This is just for you. You don't have to share it, so don't get nervous. Introverts who are sitting back there were afraid there would be sharing at some point. Oh, look who's in the back row, Father Bolin. But just for a moment of reflection on your own faith journey. And wonder in your memory, let's ask God to use our memories for a moment to call to mind the things that we need to hear and to see this morning. In a sense, I'm asking you to wonder how you got here in your own faith journey. Questions like, who taught you the faith? Who modeled faith for you? Presumably for most of us, or at least many of us, our parents are in the answer to that question. But who else? Who else modeled faith for you? Maybe never said explicit words about Jesus or faith, but you knew these were people of faith. You could see it. The experiential data about these people told you something about what they saw as important. Who were those people? Who modeled faith for you? As you tell the story of the early years of your faith life, what experiences and what images come back to you? If we were to do some sharing around this question, and I asked you, turn to the person next to you and talk about a moment, an experience, an image, a person that is very, very clear in your memory in response to this question of how you came to this place in your life of faith. How did you get here? What worked, if you will, in the formation of your heart and your mind in a life of faith? I think it's really important for us to be in touch with these images and these experiences, because while so many things have changed and our social context and our cultural context are clearly different, the core dimensions of what it means to evangelize and the core dimensions of what it means to model and share faith haven't changed. And so how do we recover, or how do we reinvigorate what we do and who we are as people of faith that will draw these young people to a deeper response, a more enthusiastic response? I want to tell you just a little bit of my faith story, not because it's so fascinating or that it needs to be preserved for the future canonization process, but rather because I think my story is fairly typical in the American Catholic experience. And I think this is very, very important for us. That is, the context within which we were shaped and formed. So I grew up actually in the South. By the time I was born, my folks moved from the South Side to further south, to the South suburbs. And we were members of a parish. And to say that the parish was everything for my family is a gross understatement. It was everything. It's where we went to school, it's where we prayed, it's where my and my sister and brother's social life existed, it's where my parents' primary social life was. It was the lens through which we saw the world. And in a sense, it was us and the rest of the world. In our little suburb, we would refer to the other ones, the Protestants, who went to other churches. My father's business was downtown, and he traveled downtown every day for his work, and so he had a social network that was outside of the life of the parish, but really for social life with my mom and the family, it was all back in the parish. My parents were, I sort of straddle a couple of generations in some sense, and I was born at the end, actually the Second Vatican Council had just ended when I was born. Now you're calculating my age. And my parents, I was the youngest of their children, and so they were greatest generation folks, right? My father was a veteran of the Second World War, and they were of that era. They were of that experience of church and culture and life. And so our family, while we were clearly moving into what would be the next generation of Catholic America, we were very much rooted in an older model, I think, by my parents and also by our parish. But the point of this observation is to say that everything about our life was the parish. Now, the upside of that was it was a total culture for us, and it shaped us and it formed us. And so the symbols and the rituals and the language of church just came very, very naturally to us, to my siblings and I and to my parents. And things like a First Friday or an act of contrition or going to the sacrament of reconciliation or getting half days at First Friday or whatever it might be that was just the soup that we were in every day, that shaped us and formed us. And so it wasn't simply an intellectual formation, it was a cultural formation, it was a social formation, and it was happening all the time. It wasn't that my parents would get up every day and say, today, let's form our kids as Catholics. Instead, my parents got up every day and simply lived in this reality which was Catholicism, which was their life, which was their story. The shortcomings of it was it had a bit of a ghetto reality to it, that it could be a little too enclosed on itself, that it could have been separated from the rest of the world. But what we lived in that model, the sociologists like to call the total culture model. And the total culture model is dead. And I think we keep trying to design programs to serve the total culture model. And we get frustrated because more people aren't coming. Or our kids are responding on surveys like we heard they sometimes respond. Here's what the sociologists describe it as. The total culture model offers a religious identity that meets the individual's needs for social location, family values, meaningful group interaction. And it does this by providing a nourishing and complex, if sometimes confining, network of institutions from cradle to grave. The aim is complete identity, theological, cultural, and sometimes even political. Affiliation with parties, for example, political parties, that you could see patterns in this. I remember it was mentioned that I went to Marist, and yes, if we were to win today and Marist were to win, the second great battle in the history of Catholicism will take place next week. You can guess what the first one was. I remember the day about a week before the high school entrance exam, and my two brothers had already gone to Marist, and so the Archdiocese entrance exam date was a week down the road, and I sort of mustered a little courage and walked in to talk to my dad about where I was deciding to go to high school. And he was reading the Tribune in the living room. He had a glass of scotch next to him. It was about 7 o'clock at night. It was his ritual of reading the paper, and I said, Dad, can I talk to you for a minute? He said, sure. And he lowered the paper. And I said, I've been thinking about it, and I'm going to take the test at Marist. And he looked at me and said, of course you are, and put the paper back up. That's what we call discernment. Or as we say in religious life, I discern, you discern, he decides. But the point of that was the idea that we would not go to a Catholic high school, and we had a fine public high school down the street, was just not in the mindset of my parents. Catholic life and Catholic education is what we did. So this total formation of our lives this way shaped us in this very deep and complete surrounding of the church. And the simple fact of the matter is, it's over. I don't think that comes as a shock to anybody, but it's over. It doesn't exist anymore. Why not? Well, for a lot of good reasons. Some are just sort of sociological reasons. The experts, the folks that like to think of this stuff, will talk about a couple of key markers. People frequently will point to either the Second Vatican Council or the poor reception of Humanae Vitae and its teaching on birth control that was the beginning of the unraveling of some of these cultural tightnesses around Catholicism. That is the tight construction of the culture. I think it actually starts long before that, and some of the sociologists believe this too, which is what really started to change this was the GI Bill. And this is a really interesting and important sociological reality for our conversation. The greatest advancement of a group of people in the history of America, insofar as socioeconomic growth, was the GI Bill's impact on Catholics after World War II. All these GIs came back from their service, and they never would have gone to college without the GI Bill. They came back, and the GI Bill said, go to college, it's on the federal government. It was our debt to you for your service. And people like my father, who never would have gone to college, I don't think, without that, came back and began to go to college. And in extraordinary numbers jumping up, the Catholic community's socioeconomic status started to soar. Irish Catholics in this country today are the single most successful / wealthiest subgroup, save Jewish Americans, in the country. That would not have happened without the GI Bill. That all these GIs came back and went to college. Interestingly, they also started to go to colleges that weren't Catholic. When I was in high school and we were talking about colleges, now it was a joke that I would say I'm thinking about going to an Ivy League school. Now it was a joke on two counts. One, they wouldn't have let my application touch the table. They would have just passed it along to the no pile. But it was also a joke because my father said, well, no good Catholic goes to the Ivy League schools. Because for such a long time, Catholics weren't at the Ivy League schools. And so this explosion of socioeconomic growth and elevation of the American Catholic community really changes who we are. In some sense, we arrived. And all sorts of data will tell us this. If we look at things like socioeconomics, class status, wealth, and those sorts of accumulations. The presence of Catholics on the Supreme Court of the United States, in the Congress of the United States, in the CEO or the C-suites of corporate America. There's this huge movement that happens beginning in the late 40s and into the 50s with the GI Bill. The reason Loyola Academy ended up in Wilmette is in part because of the GI Bill. Because the academy, as it existed on the campus of Loyola University, got squeezed out because they needed to have more room for the undergrads who were coming back from service in the war. And all these guys coming back who wanted to go to college, and the money was good because it was federal dollars paying for every one of those guys to go to school. The university expanded. They looked at Dumbach Hall where Loyola Academy existed and said, that would be another good place to put college students. Bye-bye, Academy. And the rest is Wilmette history. And if you'd like to have a few cocktails, I'll tell you more about our Wilmette history. So my point in going into this total culture model conversation is to just set a context, because I think that was the American Catholic context for a very long time. And if you think about how that total culture functioned, it had a very significant sociological function. Think about parishes in Chicago where you can drive 4 blocks and see 4 Catholic parishes. There's the German one, there's the Irish one, there's the Polish one, there's the Italian one. In Chicago forever, the joke was, but it wasn't a joke because it was reality, you identified yourself first by parish, secondly by neighborhood, and third by city. My dad had a great Jewish friend when I was a little kid named Louis Weinberg, lived in Highland Park. When I asked him where he was from, he told me his parish. It was our way of identifying ourselves, and it was our place. But remember, those Irish and German and Polish and Italian parishes grew up because they were assimilation factories. They were set up to pass on the faith, but they were also set up to help these immigrants become Americans. And that's why we created our own school system. It's why the American Catholic primary education system was so vast, because it was going to be our way of educating our kids into the mainstream of the life of America. And so I think we can argue we arrived, is great. It's also come at a great cost. Because that differentiation of ourselves from everybody else, not in a we're better than sort of way, but that we're different than sort of way, we've lost much of that. And in the assimilation, the question that we can ask ourselves and ponder is, what did we lose in the assimilation? What did we lose in arriving? And so that total culture model, I think, is dead. Okay, specifically, let's talk about teens. If you're looking at the handout, I'm going to pick up the pace here, don't worry. I'm only on the second bullet point. This is still basically my introduction, right? This is going to be a long day, everybody. Good news is the football game's at 1 o'clock, so I have to be out of here. Teenagers and faith, what do we know? What's the context? Mike referenced a couple of good studies. The Pew and the Gallup folks do this study all the time, and they've got lots of longitudinal data about young people in faith and older people in faith. And then CARA, the Center for Applied Research in the Apostolate, which is headquartered at Georgetown, but it's the official research wing of the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops. And so they do really, really good work, too, in trying to discover what's going on with Catholics in America. I want to talk about another one, which I find more interesting in some sense, which is the National Survey of Youth and Religion, the NSYR. It's on the page there. And if you go to I believe it's nsyr.com or org, just Google it. There's a treasure trove of data, studies, reports about teenagers and faith. The NSYR was overseen and is still overseen by a sociologist of American religion named Christian Smith. Good name for a sociologist of American religion. Christian Smith. Christian Smith started the study almost 20 years ago, so he has 20 years of data about young people. And it's not just about Catholics, it's about all teenagers in America. So it's Catholic, other Christian denominations, Jewish kids, Muslim kids, so it's not just about Catholics. Interestingly, Smith, when he started this work, was on faculty at the University of North Carolina. When his research started to get popular and people were seeing there was something really good and important going on here, Notre Dame gobbled him up. So Notre Dame went down and gave him a fully endowed professorship. He moved to South Bend and joined the faculty there. Interestingly, 2 years after arriving at Notre Dame, he converted to Catholicism. He was an evangelical Christian before that. So we got one. And he's a great guy. He's a great speaker. If you can ever see him speak, he's really wonderful to listen to. So he's got this 20 years of data, and they're interviews. So it's not just, one of the problems with religion research is it always focuses on practice, and it rarely gets at habits, attitudes, and perceptions. And so practice is, how frequently do you go to Mass? How frequently do you receive the Sacrament of Reconciliation? How frequently do you read a religious magazine? How frequently? Those are things I can measure, and you say on a Likert scale, seldom or never, or you say once a month, twice a month, never, whatever it might be. And forever, the data on religion and life was about practice. What Smith is able to dig into with this qualitative research is more on perceptions, attitudes, beliefs. What do they believe? Now here's what he's learned. First of all, when he started out, he had no intention of devoting a big chunk of his research to Catholics. They were just going to be another group here. We represent about 25% of the American populace, so I think he figured it'll be about 25% of what I have to say. As he got into his research, he realized Catholics were going to need their own chapter in this book. Yay. No. Catholics need their own chapter because the data are so staggeringly depressing. compared to other religious communities in other religious traditions in the United States. What he discovered about American, and I'm sorry, when I speak of American, I'm speaking of the United States of America. I have to speak frequently with Jesuit groups where there's also Canadians in the room, and they always get upset if I just say American, but I'm talking about U.S. American Catholics. This is who he's looking at, not Canadians, as wonderful as Canadians are. Here's what Smith discovers about American Catholic kids, and I've put those bullet points there. They are befuddled, they are inarticulate, and they follow a religion that Smith has come to call moralistic therapeutic deism. Okay. First of all, they're befuddled. They don't know what they believe. They can't articulate what they believe. This isn't expecting them to be theologians or apologists like St. Augustine or Thomas Aquinas, but can you give voice to what it is you believe as a Catholic about X, Y, Z, whatever it might be? Incredibly inarticulate and befuddled. It's a great word because my daily life living and working in a high school tells me they are in fact befuddled. And inarticulate. And this is a key piece here because articulation is a huge part of the puzzle of learning anything. You know, the old maxim that you really don't know something until you have to teach it. Well, that maxim suggests that in the teaching, in the articulation, in putting myself in the other person's perspective, that's when I really own the material. That's when I really get it. Parents, you will say, I'm sure, that perhaps the time where your faith was most vibrant when you were forced and invited to share it with your children. And those great questions. My father and mother's trump card always was, when you asked a question they couldn't answer, was, it's a mystery. And you shouldn't be asking that question. I was somehow offending God if I asked the question. That put an end to my theological career right there. Thanks, Mom. But that articulation piece is key. And then what Smith does is, after listening for a long time to all these kids talk about their faith, he said they have a religion. They have a set of core beliefs or attitudes. They're not Catholic necessarily, but there's a great similarity in what they're saying about what they believe. And he names it moralistic therapeutic deism. Now think about the three words just for a second. Moralistic therapeutic deism. And again, if you want to read lots more about this, just Google it and you'll have more reports and data and opinions than you ever wanted. And on a cold, rainy day, it might be fun to curl up and read some of these reports. Moralistic therapeutic deism. So first, moralistic. There's something in it about a code of right and wrong. Something. Therapeutic. We have so embraced the therapeutic model as a cultural norm in this country that it's clearly affected how we live religion as well. In other words, therapy serves my need. Look, therapy is a great thing. It's a tremendous gift. It helps so many of us, and it's important to all of us at some level. This is not a trashing of therapy, but sort of this therapeutic model, the talking cure, as Freud would have called it. I call it kind of the Oprahification of America. It was like the explosion of how we always needed to sit on a couch and talk to each other and talk about it, and the outcome of the therapy is my good. That is, I'm going to get better as a result of this therapy. I will feel better about myself. Those are awesome goals. Therapy's wonderful. But there's nothing about anybody else, really. It's about me. Moralistic therapeutic deism. Now, deism, not to go into it, is a school of thought that was condemned by the Catholic Church a long time ago. It's one of the condemnations we got right. Deism is that, you may remember it from Theo 101 in college or hearing it somewhere along the line. Deism was this idea about God that says this: God creates the world, God sets the life of the world in motion, and then God steps back and watches it from a great distance. The image that's sometimes used by philosophers or theologians is the deist would say God is like a great clockmaker. God builds the clock, God pushes the pendulum, it starts to run, and then God steps back and watches the clock. What the Catholic Church has always found offensive about deism is that it fails to recognize that God is deeply involved in God's creation. The whole point of the incarnation is that God comes into the human experience, that God takes on flesh, that God becomes one of us. And so we insist as the Catholic Christian community that God is in this creation, not distant from it. That God is, as St. Paul says, all creation is still groaning toward its completion, and God is in that groaning. That God is laboring for God's creation. And so deism doesn't work for us because it suggests that God is far away. Now, here's what Smith says moralistic therapeutic deism sounds like. There are 5 principles. And again, just listen to it. Don't worry, you're not taking notes. There's not a quiz. Nothing counts here. This is what he said. As I've listened to American Catholic teenagers, here's what they believe. Number 1, a God exists who created and orders the world and watches over human life on earth. All right, can't live with that. Right? Secondly, God wants people to be good, nice, and fair to each other, as taught in the Bible and most world religions. God wants us to be good, nice, and fair. I concur. Third, the central goal of life is to be happy and feel good about oneself. 4, God does not need to be particularly involved in one's life except when God is needed to resolve a problem. 5, good people go to heaven when they die. Now, I got to tell you, the first time I read Smith's book and came across this, I said, yeah, that's them. That's how these kids that I get the great privilege of serving every day at Loyola, that's how they think about faith. My friend Mark Massa, who's a Jesuit theologian at Boston College, simplifies those 5 creeds, those 5 elements of the moralistic therapeutic deistic creed this way. God is nice. Most people are nice. Most people except Hitler go to heaven. All other theological and ethical statements are relative, being true only if they work for you. And 5th, whatever. So moralistic therapeutic deism gets to, Smith wants to argue, and I'm arguing he's right, it gets to a way of thinking and perceiving what matters about God and what's true that is in the mind and the hearts of our teenagers. You notice a couple of things that are missing from this creed. Other people. Suffering. How do I make sense of struggle or suffering? It's nowhere in there. There's no cross in there. There's no theodicy, that field of theological inquiry about how do you make sense about bad things happening to good people or bad things happening in the context of a good and all-powerful God. There's nothing in there about that experience of human life. There's no Jerusalem here insofar as the Gospels are concerned. There's kind of a let's be nice. Let's be nice to each other. But I don't have to be bound to you or to any other thing. That second to last one for Smith, God does not need to be particularly involved except when needed to resolve a problem. Go look at the grotto at Notre Dame and count the candles that are lighted in final exam time. It's a heck of a lot more lumen power down there on those nights. That is, my connection to God, because I'm in this deistic framework, my connection to God is far away, but in certain ways, at certain times, I can sort of invoke and negotiate with God to get what I need. And then otherwise, I put God on the shelf. It's not relational, it's contractual. It's not a relationship, which is the centerpiece of Christian faith. God becomes one of us to enter into this deeply incarnate, personal relationship with us. So this is our context. Moving to that second column, just if you're scoring at home, how did we get here? I think the total culture model is dead. I think that sense of arriving socioeconomically has come at a cost. The third thing is we begin to see a serious decline in the formation of young people in the faith after Vatican II. Look, the Second Vatican Council, 1962 to 1965, this extraordinarily graced moment in the history of the Roman Catholic community. Holy, holy, holy thing. But one of the things that happened in the liturgical reforms and in some of the theological shift, keep in mind, many of the battles we see still being fought, whether it's between the Pope and critics or anybody else's, it's continuing to try to actually implement what we said was true and we believed at Vatican II. So, for example, in 1963, the bishops in the leadership of the Church gathered at the Second Vatican Council take on a whole new attitude about relationship to other religions. A much humbler position, a much more gracious position, and we're still trying to live that out. But one of the things that happened was you begin to see the disintegration, I would argue, of religious formation, both in Catholic schools and in Catholic parishes' religious education programs. This is not an indictment of anybody. This is a huge sociological shift that was happening that came at a cost. I'll own this. So I was born in 1966. The council closed in 65. To the best of my memory or stories that I'd listened to my parents tell, our parish was pretty forward-thinking and obedient in adopting in implementing the tenets of the Second Vatican Council. Most people felt those most dramatically, of course, liturgically in the experience of the celebration of the sacraments. But one of the places that you found it shifting was, for example, the staffing of our Catholic grade school. As the vocation numbers started to decline rather dramatically, such that by the time you get to 1968, you see this rapid decline in vocations to religious life. And you see, for example, our Catholic grade school go from staffed primarily or almost exclusively by religious women, on whose backs the entire Catholic education system was built in this country, those numbers start to diminish. And I have memories of what my religious education was in my Catholic grade school in the 70s. It was atrocious. And again, I'm not throwing anybody under the bus, I'm not naming those teachers or anything. This is what was happening. But what was happening is something was being passed on that wasn't particularly well thought out. And as hard as people were trying to do, I made a lot of artistic projects of Jesus' face made out of macaroni noodles in those years. That can be a good exercise. It's therapeutic for me now on a slow Saturday. But there was really a decline in two things: the quality of the programming and the resources and the training we provided to the people who were teaching it. You went from religious women who had been formed for many years in the Catholic tradition and the articulation of it, and they were taught how to teach, to very well-intentioned lay folks with no real training in theology or how to articulate the religious tradition. And so you start to have a bit of a disintegration in the formation path. And from a sociological perspective, this is a problem. Because one of the mantras in this whole study, which was mentioned by Mike at his introduction, is, as the sociologists like to say, we will get what we are. We will get what we are. In other words, if you want to know what the church is going to look like in 20 years, look at their parents of the kids right now. We will get what we are. It's social reproduction. And our kids are going to be a lot like their parents, as much as they say they don't want to be. They, in fact, do want to be. Okay. Is everybody okay so far? I'm going to land here soon. So let's move to the last pillar here, if you will, the what do we do? I got nothing. No. Got a lot of property to sell. The good news is there's some really good things that come out of Smith's studies too. And I don't want to go into those in any long, great depth, but just a couple of things that do come out of Smith. And as you hear his observations, think about the practical ramifications of these things for OLPH, for your kids, and for teenagers in general. What he has found, which I would call good news, is that for religiously serious teenagers, faith is activated, formed, and practiced through specific religious and spiritual practices. That is, rituals, rites, and practices matter. And even though they might say, I don't want to go to Mass, there is still, in the religiously formed kids who have a higher identification with their faith, those rituals matter. But it puts a higher price on how we execute those rituals. It puts a much higher value on how we think about what those rituals look like, feel like, how we speak to them, how we involve young people, etc. Secondly, he finds that teens are not spiritual seekers. We have this illusion, I think, and we talk about this with young adults all the time, people in their 20s and 30s, that they're seekers or searchers, and they're just sort of drifting around, and they pick up a little Buddhist practice over here, and then they like this notion of Islam, and they really like going to Willow Creek once in a while because of that feel, and they're sort of, it's syncretism in theological language, right? You're sort of building a faith, and you're just sort of pulling things together from all over the place. Smith's sense of the teenagers is that's not really who they are and how they work. Further, he affirms that kids watch their parents closely. And even though adolescence by definition is rebellion, they want you parents to be people of faith. They want you to stand for something. They want you to model the faith. Their job is to say, I'm not interested, that's stupid, my science background as a 7th grader tells me that that faith tradition is wrong. You know, all these sorts of reasons that a kid, it's boring, Father's homilies are terrible, the music stinks, I don't know anybody there, I went to Mass last month, whatever it might be, they're going to push on it. You know this better than I do. You have to live with them. I just get them from 8 to 3. They want, though, Smith says, and my experience confirms this, they want you to stand for something. They want you to be a role model. They want you to be a beacon that points to something deeper and richer than the whims of the news stories of the day. That's good news. They want role models, and role models are continually cited by young people with active faith as one of the main reasons they participate in and are active in a faith life. Some adult is showing them what that looks like, and no adult is more important than their parents. So pay attention to the parents. So one of the things at Loyola that we've had to think about, when I got to Loyola 9 years ago, this stuff was echoing in my head. This is our context. We have kids from freshman to senior year, and then they move on. And we have 2 transition points that we have a hand in, when they're handed off to us from 8th grade and when we hand them off to college. And those transition points are crucial turning points in life practices, especially around faith. The old data used to tell us that what you saw at around age 18 in the typical American Catholic was detachment from religious institutions and then reattachment around the time of their marriage and the baptism of their children. So the data for a very long time showed this pattern. And we in the Catholic Church, I think, sort of leaned back and said, yeah, it makes sense. That's sort of what I've observed. That's okay, as long as they come back for the marriage and the baptism. Andy Greeley's sociological data was full of this information. That is, the stuff that they were doing at the University of Chicago and at Arizona was looking at this pattern of what the sociologists called detachment and then reattachment. And we saw this pattern playing out. Here's the staggering bad news. They're not reattaching. They're detaching just like they used to, actually at greater numbers, and they're not coming back. Here's the doubly difficult bad news, I think. It's not because they're mad about something in particular. It's not because they're mad at all. It's because they're indifferent. And you got nothing for me, church. In other words, they're not saying this hot button issue or this hot button issue or this hot button issue. I can't remain a Catholic at the age of 20 because of the church's position on women in the church and the role of women in the world. It's not that. Now, all these hot button issues are really important, and there's tough conversations we have to have about them, but that's not why they've disengaged. They've disengaged out of indifference. You're just another thing out there, church. Now remember, go back to that total culture model. We didn't have traveling teams. We didn't have, if I wanted to play an instrument, I played in the Catholic grade school band. I didn't have a private coach that was 3 suburbs over. My parents' social network was very small, because my mom was a stay-at-home mom, and my dad's work was sort of a simplified, here's what I do, and here's my world of doing it. When you have this explosion of relationships and commitments in the lives of young people, the church has become kind of just another one of those things. one of those things that I'm connected to somehow. And I'll take it or leave it based on how it makes me feel. So this is our context, and I suspect that your sense of this is, yeah, that's how I've experienced it, and that's how I've experienced young people thinking about that. I think, though, we've sold ourselves short, and we've missed some opportunities. And so when we started thinking about what Loyola should be, when we were doing our strategic plan 7 years ago or whatever it was, I asked that we stop simply referring to ourselves as a Jesuit secondary school and speak of ourselves as a Jesuit Catholic faith and education center. That is, we got them for 4 years. We've also got their parents, because we can get to the parents. We can engage them. If we sponsor a talk on a Tuesday evening and say, there's going to be a great talk, the world's foremost Catholic theologian is going to be there to explain the most important things of the faith, we wouldn't get this many people. But if I said the same thing, the world's foremost Catholic theologian is going to be there tomorrow night in the gym, and he's going to talk about the central tenets of the faith and how to get into college, I'll fill the gym. So be creative. Talk differently to your parents. Engage the parents differently. What I have discovered about the parents, and the parents are my age, right? We are of this generation, go back to my references to how we were formed in the faith. We are of that generation who were not particularly well formed. We are not particularly articulate as a cohort in what the faith means. What I experience all the time from parents, if you sort of push on the question, why are you paying for Loyola Academy? Frequently, in addition to all the things about outstanding secondary school, great tradition, wonderful community, they will say something in that befuddled language of their children, which basically comes down to, I want you to do that faith thing for them. In other words, they outsource faith development. And they want us to do it. And that doesn't mean, the good news is they want it. The good news is it's not a hostility. They're paying for it. They're choosing it. But they don't feel equipped to do it themselves. If we just do it, if we outsource it and we run theology classes and community service and retreats and all those sorts of things and don't engage the parents, that is wasted time. Because of all that data that tells us the kids are watching the parents. The youth minister, the priest who runs the school, the theology teachers, the campus ministers, yeah, they're great, they're important, but I'm really watching my parents. And if faith development is just another thing we outsource, like the violin teacher or the private coach or the college counselor that I hire on the side or whatever else it is, another thing we've sort of outsourced because we love our kids, and we do, it's not going to click. It's not going to hold. So what do we do? Finally, 3 minutes and I'll stop. You don't want to say that. So here's some very, very, all that context, all that reality about who our parents are, who our kids are, what the culture says, where American Catholics fit in this scene, here's some things to keep in mind. First of all, I didn't have it in my notes, but I want to address this point about science and religion. That's a big deal coming out of that CARA study, where these kids want to dismiss religion as hocus pocus and irrational habits, especially as opposed to science. One of the interesting things that's in that CARA study that they observed, the authors of the study, is this is another argument for Catholic education. Why? Because in the same hallway, we're teaching theology and science. And so I've engaged our science faculty since that study came out and said, we've got to talk about how these two hallways come closer together. There's some wonderful things. The Vatican Observatory, for example, which is run by the Jesuits. Paul Muller, who's a Chicago Jesuit, who is the superior of the Vatican Observatory community. Paul Muller, Brother Guy Consolmagno, these guys are all PhDs in physics and astronomy who run the Vatican Observatory. The Vatican has a telescope at Castel Gandolfo, the Pope's summer home, and they also use the University of Arizona's telescope. So the Vatican is watching the skies very carefully. He's coming back. They're watching the skies. They're watching the skies very, very carefully. There's great scholarship and science happening there. These guys are available to speak anytime. They have extraordinary webinars. They have great video. I mean, how do we get people of faith talking about their faith in the context of science? That's how you address this divergence that the kids see. That these people are believers And they believe, too, in the beauty of science, because science and creation are a gift of the God who's inviting us to explore them. So Catholic schools, it seems to me, are in a unique position to tie those things together more concretely. So other practical things, and I'm on my last column there. Pay attention to the parents. What does that mean? I think it means you engage them in any way you can. I think it means you help form them in any way you can. I think it means you have to have spirituality programs for them. We have the great privilege of being rooted in the Jesuit tradition at Loyola. And the spirituality of St. Ignatius is this incredibly positive, world-affirming, practical, pragmatic spirituality. We can run more and more programs for our parents in Ignatian spirituality. We should have better speakers that come in and talk about faith and science. Pay attention to the parents, because we will get what we are. Secondly, this is a maxim of St. Ignatius. Go in their door to take them out your door. You got to get them where they are. The best mass... There are two priests on staff at Loyola Academy, myself and Father Stan Zarnecki, an awesome, wonderful priest who came to us a year ago. I don't keep a tally of this, but I can't tell you how many masses Stan and I say in the course of a week. And Stan, our perspective, our attitude is this: we never say no to a request for a mass. Because every team, every club, every retreat group, they want to have a mass. I'm not going to say no. And it proves this point. They love when it's their cohort that they know. When it's my crew team going to Mass, sitting around the altar in this intimacy, they don't even think of it as Mass anymore, but they love it. I'll give you an example. We have a survey that we do every year. Jesuit high schools have done it for 35 years, where we're measuring these sorts of things and the growth we can measure in our kids in categories like religious, intellectual competence, committed to doing justice, all these categories of qualities we think are important. One of the sets of questions is about religious practice. And there's a question that says, I feel close to God at Mass. And then you say, strongly agree, sort of agree, don't agree at all. We were getting these high numbers of, not really, don't feel close to God at Mass. So I started getting focus groups. I just started pulling kids, seniors in and talking to them. And I'd say, so you don't feel close to God at Mass, huh? Well, of course, if I present it that way, And I always made sure to do it before the college acceptances went out, because they think I have a big phone on my desk that's a hotline to colleges, and I just pick it up and no. It's true. So I sort of tried to dig a little deeper what they were thinking and what they were feeling about this. And they would immediately go to Mass in the parish. That is, when you ask, do you feel close to God at Mass, they thought of Faith, Hope, OLPH, not OLPH, Faith, Hope, Sacred Heart, St. Joe's, Queen of All Saints, St. Mary of the Woods, whatever parish they belong to. They think of Sunday Mass at the parish when you ask about Mass. Okay. So then I'd say, did you go to Mass on your Kairos retreat? And they'd say, oh yeah, we had 3 Masses on our Kairos retreat. Did you enjoy that experience? Oh, it was awesome. I loved Kairos. Mass on Kairos was awesome. Remember, Father, you sat with us and we acted out the gospel. Yeah. Did you feel close to God there? Oh, yeah. Then why didn't you say that on the survey? Because they don't think of that as Mass when you ask about Mass. It's still Mass. It's a valid, licit Mass. Don't worry. Don't report me. Don't write your letters. It's a Mass, but in their mind, Mass is the parish thing. You got to go in their door, and they got to see themselves in it for them to actually connect to it. And I know that we know that, but they've got to own the thing, and they want to do it with their cohort. A third thing I would say, this is really for preachers, for priests and other folks who preach or teach. You got to preach to the imagination. The Catholic imagination is one of the greatest gifts we have, that is sometimes referred to as the sacramental imagination. The beauty of the Catholic tradition is stories, is stained glass windows, is saints. It's these things that are very distinctively Catholic, not just culturally, but theologically. They speak to us in a way different than a theological treatise. Or here are the 4 points you need to know. The stories and the imagination. Catholics Back to Greeley for just a moment. Greeley used to make this great distinction in his research between the analogical imagination and the sacramental imagination. Greeley's observation was that American Protestants are analogical in the way they imagine, which is to say everything sort of goes right together, black and white, left and right. The sacramental imagination, the analogical imagination is the sacramental imagination. They had a more literal one on the Protestant side. The sacramental imagination is multivalent. It's both and, not either or. Is he human or divine? Yes. It's both and. Well, how do you live with the both and? Well, you churn a lot of paperwork out and philosophical treatises about homoousion and homoousios and all these sorts of things. But ultimately, the community tries to live into the mystery of how extraordinary it is that this is what God chose to do. The imagination necessary to live that faith, and we are losing the imagination. So preach to it, sing to it, write to it, tell stories. My family had a rule, my parents had a rule, you couldn't leave the dinner table until you told a story or made us laugh. The stories matter. And that matters in preaching and how we pass on the faith. We've got to keep developing these role models, and you parents are the biggest ones. We have to devote more resources to the formation of these young people and to the formation of the formators. God bless these wonderful people, many of you in this room, who volunteer to be faith formators, and also our teachers in our schools, Catholic schools, who are charged with faith formation. But we got to help them get better at what they're doing. It's tough. Some of you know this. But how do we help? How do we create systems for that to happen? Another really, really important point is this. We've got to reconnect service and Jesus. The video is great. Some of those kids are our great campus ministry groupies. Awesome, awesome kids. And every one of them speaks about service. And any of you who have been around young people, high school or college-age kids, or even those in their 20s and 30s young adults, you've heard it 1,000 times from them. They'll do service at the drop of a hat. If we say, next Saturday, Loyola young alum meeting at this big shoulder school to do some painting, we will shut the sign up down in 5 minutes because they want to do it. Why? Feels good. It's the right thing to do. It's a communal experience. It's to the greater good. They feel like they're a part of something bigger than themselves. Those are all really, really great things. We've developed extraordinary service programs in our schools and in our parishes, but we've done a lousy job of rooting it in Jesus. We've done a lousy job of talking about the qualitative difference of service in a Catholic context. Let me be careful. I'm not saying our service is better than the service kids at GBS or New Trier do. I'm not saying that at all. Everybody does service now. It's good citizenship, it's the right thing to do, and you got to have it on your college application. So service is it's in the vernacular and the practice of our community. And that's good, that's great, we're better for it. But we've got to do a better job at connecting that to Jesus. That we're doing this because Jesus calls us to this. We're doing this because we believe that the central observation of Jesus, the command of Jesus, is if you learn how to give yourself away, you will become your better self. If you hold on to your life, you lose it. If you give it away, you get it. Crazy calculation. And yet, it's the core calculus of Christianity. And so I want to invite you into service because if in some small way you come to an experience of giving yourself away, and I hope you remember this someday, young person, when you're married, and your call now is to give yourself completely to that person, if you can't learn that here, that there's some deeply theological God reality at work in your service, then we've missed the point of having service, and we really should just stop the service programs and let the Scouts and the Kiwanis Club do it. You got to connect it to Jesus in church. Shame on us for this. And the Jesuits were at the front of this. We got really good after, when Pedro Arrupe was the superior general, he was a holy, extraordinary leader of the Jesuits. We pushed service, this women and men for others, so well that there's not a Jesuit school in the world that doesn't have a vibrant service program. We haven't always been as good as we ought to be at being companions of Jesus who talk about the service as Jesus related. I think They want to do service. There's the door to go in, but you got to take them out your door, which is, I want to talk about Jesus here. And it doesn't mean you beat them over the head and sing bad songs about Jesus. It means you invite them to a deeper reflection about what they're experiencing in the service and tie it to Jesus. I've never been on a service trip with kids where at the end of it, one of them doesn't say exactly what you would expect them to say, which is, I think I got more out of that than those people did who I served. The answer is, absolutely. You were terrible. We went to paint a house. It looked better when we got there. But what you discovered in that feeling deep down when you thought to yourself, I think I got more out of this than they did, is yes, you did. You got a glimpse of yourself giving. You caught a little bit of that reality, which is what Jesus speaks to in your heart and says, learn to give yourself away. That's what my disciples do. Learn that happiness and joy in a life can only come to the measure at which you are able to give yourself away. Don't be stingy. That's what you discovered. But we have to help name that for them. We have to help name that and set it in our faith context because they want more of it, and we can help provide it. And then finally, and I won't go into this at all, but the sociologists talk about if the total culture model is dead, then what's the new model? And I think there's a lot of them. But there's one that they will point to that has been successful in other religious contexts, and it's more of an evangelical model. That is, it's cultivating in our young people the articulation of the faith and then giving them opportunities to actually go out and articulate their faith. An example for us would be Kairos retreats. Kairos retreats are about peer ministry. They are about adults, but more importantly, peers of the young people standing up and giving some testimony to their faith and their life story. That's an evangelical model to give witness to speak to. The Mormon tradition, for example, of the young people being sent out on mission to go be Mormons and to go talk to the world about their faith. It cultivates a depth of commitment in them because of the call to be evangelical. That is, to tell the story, to give some witness to what you've experienced. Things like Kairos and tech retreats are a great start in that, to move to a different kind of model. Yeah, thanks. So the two comments, really important ones, is that therapy, I don't want to characterize it simply as totally self-centered somehow, but rather there's an other-centeredness, there's an obvious other-centeredness dimension to therapy, because if I'm healthier, if I'm in a better place, I can relate better to everybody else. Truly, great comment. And the second was that there's some good programming going on. You're always welcome at Loyola to our programming, where we've done different sorts of topics that help folks, we hope, become better parents. You made the obvious right point, or good point on mine, right? I had total agreement with you. It's doable, right? It is doable. So the IBC, the Ignatian Volunteer Corps, is folks usually after their careers become a part of this community that's committed to doing great work, but they also are deeply steeped in the Ignatian or Jesuit spiritual tradition, and they use that as their reflection as they go through the experience. Yeah, exactly. And you know, we have the route-based service program is a service program every quarter. In this quarter, there are 630 Loyola kids that go out after school and go to various sites all over the place to do an afternoon of service. We used to do that and say, isn't that super? Now we do it and say, but part of this is at the end of the quarter, we host a pizza party where they meet in small groups. They've had written reflections. We've built a really cool portal online where they can share these things, and then we have a conversation about what you experienced, where'd you experience God in this? So to do the real reflection and to cultivate. And that's a really bigger, much bigger and important macro point, I would say. One of the measurable outcomes, I would say, that we've been trying to develop over the last bunch of years there is to simply cultivate a spirit of real Ignatian reflection, or a spirit of Christian reflection in our kids. In other words, can we carve out time and space for silence? Can we carve out time and space and lead them through a reflection and get them in the habit of reflecting? I find a lot of time, you say to people, oh, you should reflect more, you should pray more, and people go, I don't know what? How do you want me to do that? So the reflection, like the daily examen, for example, which can be a simple, repetitive habit prayer, is something to cultivate, right? And we found that we had a learning outcome that we had to identify 6 years ago, which was they need to learn how to be quiet in the chapel. It wasn't because they were rambunctious or tearing the place down. It was, can we teach them how to be in a place with a community quietly at prayer and to want that? It's been wildly successful. They like it, they want it, and the more noise that's pumped into their heads and the more noise that's surrounding us in the culture, the more they want it. So your point is well taken that you got to build the reflection into it, but you also have to scaffold young people up to understand how to do that. And I think oftentimes religious people, priests, folks who are great, campus ministers or youth ministers, we've spent a huge chunk of our lives learning how to pray this the way we pray or thinking the way we think, and then we just sort of turn to people and say, you should do this. And people look at you like, well, thanks for the advice, but how do I do that? What does it look like to pray? The one thing I know about prayer, and I don't know a lot about prayer, but the grace of listening to people in spiritual direction over a bunch of years and thinking about my own prayers, nobody thinks they do it right. Nobody. But the right way to pray is that you pray. Just pray. Create the time, listen for God, read scripture, spiritual reading, pray familiar prayers, talk to a spiritual director. I mean, everybody thinks we're doing it wrong or poorly, or certainly everybody thinks I don't do it enough. But to teach people how to pray is a big part of that too. So the observation is, he was struck by the comment that Smith finds the kids very inarticulate, but he actually sees young people as very articulate and more articulate than his own peers growing up. On faith or in general? In general. Oh, they're much more verbal, I think. And I agree with you. I mean, I think they do express themselves much more. I mean, how many times a day when you were growing up did you tell everybody in your social network where you were? They do it 75 times a day. Instagram, here's where I am. This is what I'm doing. One, I don't care. And two, there's something terribly fragile about needing to announce that all the time. I see on LinkedIn all the time. I've never had a presence on Facebook. I don't want it. I am on Twitter at Father Pat McGrath. And I'm on LinkedIn because it's got kind of a professional job thing. And it's astounding to me on both Twitter and LinkedIn the number of times young people, not necessarily just high school people, but 20s and 30s, announce something. I am pleased to announce that I have taken a job as a trainee in the such and such program at such and such a bank. I'm happy for you, but I don't need the announcement. Or I'm happy to say that I have committed to Loyola University Chicago. Okay, good, but it's strange to me. So there is this articulation of their place and their experience that has exploded, but when it comes to these matters of faith, Smith has found and I would find, and I think you see it here. I think you saw it in the video. I think the video is a good example of, they're very articulate young people. Those are smart kids, especially the Loyola ones. They're smart and they are articulate. But if you're pushing on the faith stuff underneath it, we get to the service, they'll talk to you like that. Oh, I do 100 hours a year and I love it. I'm in this program and I do that and I love it. What more? What's going on there? What's happening to you? And look, I'm not trying to set an expectation that's unreasonable for an adolescent. I'm just saying, how can we scaffold them to a place of deeper reflection on what's really going on there? Yeah, thanks. No, I complete agreement. The parents are absolutely essential, and that's all throughout Smith's research, and it's certainly out of it. It concurs with my experience at the school. If the parent buy-in is there, that makes a difference. Maybe one more person, and then I got to cut it off. Yes, ma'am. Yeah, it's a great point, and I think it's embedded in those principles of moralistic therapeutic deism, right? That sensibility about I see the commonalities, which is sort of a least common denominator in some sense, and can't we all just get along and sort of live and agree to, we'll nod at each other and agree at that, and then it really demands very little of me. But yeah, absolutely, I think, and I think it's. There's an old maxim in philosophy which is perception requires contrast. So if you hang a white sheet on a white wall, you don't see the sheet. If you hang a red sheet on a white wall, you see the sheet. So there has to be a contrast to be able to see something. And I think while there were so many limitations of what they like to refer to as the ghetto Catholicism or the total culture model, there was certainly a sense there, though, that I understood myself better in contrast. The downside of it was we didn't necessarily get along as well as we should have, and we were failing in our duty to talk to each other. But it fleshed out more clearly my perception of what's distinctive about this tradition that I belong to. Give a limping metaphor along those lines. If a person is Italian American and my culture is really important to me and I live in an Italian American neighborhood, I want you to go talk to the Poles and the Irishmen and everybody else and see your common humanity, but I don't want you to give up your Italianness. There's something about God's creation and diversity that needs to be played out because of what you bring to this conversation. And likewise, I think that desire to reach across and find commonalities, while so good and holy, is not intended then to therefore be some sort of a watering down to a least common denominator that really asks very little of us. Yeah, I think you're right. You guys are extraordinary for having this conversation today, and I'm happy to throw a little gasoline on the fire so you can talk about it some more. I'm happy to be helpful going forward in any way I can, and I think it's good for me to stop and let you move on to whatever is next. So thank you very, very much.